How's it going, folks? Welcome to the Writer's Block. You are viewing slash consuming slash reading slash listening slash whatever way you're consuming this. Welcome. Here today we have me. I'm Cody. The one who looks like me is Jonah. And then the other four people who aren't our family is Jeffrey, Cameron, Steven, and Erica. Say hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
So following our discussion from last time, we're going to be talking about how we outline, or rather in some of our cases, how we don't outline. Now, last week we talked about how we come up with our world, how we world build, how we do stuff like that. But this is specifically, how do you set events so that they will follow logically and things will happen in the correct order? I have recently become an outline convert. For a long time, for several years, I just discovery wrote. I just wrote whatever it was in my head that I wanted to happen. And after being disappointed with the way that came out, for my recent book, I decided, look, I'm going to put down in a Word document, I'm going to put down the events that happen. I started out I separated the book into parts. And then I just wrote, okay, here's what happens in part one. I have 4 viewpoint characters. Here's what happens to this viewpoint character. Here's what happens to this viewpoint character. Here's what's happening to this one. And it's been really liberating, actually. It's given me a lot of ease in writing, specifically figuring out how to get from what chapter I'm on to where I need it to go, because I know where it's going. So yeah, I am an outline convert. What else do we think for those of you who are not outline converts?
I would say that I'm probably somewhere in the middle. For pretty much everything that I've written, I have started out with a 1 to 2 page bulleted outline, which is not a ton of material if you talk to other folks who outline. It is really, the way that I tend to come up with my stories is I get the main idea for the place and the people and what I want to have happen, and sort of a handful of major events that I want to have happen throughout the story, handful of major sort of character arc signposts along the way. And I will arrange those bullet points into a 3-act structure where, you know, you've got your first act, second act, third act, and we can get more into 3-act structure another time if we want to. But generally speaking, it's just the very roughest and most important events that I have set up beforehand. And so there's still a lot of empty space in between to connect these dots. What that ends up meaning, at least for me so far, is that I always, going back after I've written the book, if I go back and look at my outline, there are some significant deviations where I may not even end up where I thought I was going to end up, because there was stuff in the middle that I wasn't aware of that caught me off guard, that changed how the story was going to progress. I think if I were more detailed in my outlines, that would probably happen less. On the other hand, every time I go to make a more detailed outline, my brain really resists, and I look at what I've got and I'm like, that's good. And I just go back to writing. So I don't know if that means that I'm doing it right for me, or if I just need to push through a block somehow.
I found, just to kind of support what you're saying, I found like when I've done outline things as well, they've inevitably changed like kind of by a lot, because I find when I'm outlining, by definition, it's on a surface level. So I'm not really immersive enough in what's happening. And then when I start having to put all the words on the actual computer screen, now I gotta really be in there. Like I find when stuff doesn't make sense in my story, it's because I was not being enough in the lived experience of the characters right then. And then once I'm really in that lived experience, I'm like, they wouldn't do this. She wouldn't do that, this person wouldn't do that, and then it all kind of has to change and get fixed. So I find like it's really hard to be in that lived space when you're just outlining, because kind of by definition, you're not really thinking about what it's really like to be in detail right there.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because that was sort of that's that where you said, look, whatever is not happening as I wanted to, it's stemming from the fact that I'm not in the lived experience. That was precisely what drove me to outlining. Every time when I wrote, every time I was like, oh man, why, going back through finished books, I'd be like, why would my characters do this? Why would they do that? And I go, it's because I just had them do whatever I thought was right, but in many instances it didn't work. Because for me, the way I get to know my characters is by outlining, is by doing the world building stuff we talked about last week, where I go, okay, what's the environment around them? What are their interests? What are their stuff like that? And I can't do that when I'm trying to think, oh, what should this person say at this moment? So it's kind of interesting that we have these exact opposite experiences based on the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else who, as we sort of go down the hierarchy of how much outlining we do, is there anybody who does even less outlining than as you talked about?
I was going to say, speaking of completely opposite experiences, Coda, you talked about, being an outline convert. Does that make me the outline heretic then? Because I was never a full outliner. Like, I was never the kind of person who would have a separate document where I go, here's what's going to happen here and here's what's going to happen here before I wrote it. But in my first 2 novels that I wrote, I at least had an idea of what each of the 3 acts would look like. Like, I never wrote it down, but I had at least images in my head of okay, here's something important that happens in Act 1, here's what happens in Act 2, and I had some inkling of what would happen in the ending. And it's not that I didn't like those books, it's just that those books, the hardest parts of them for me were after I got to one of those points. Because I'd get to that point that I was super excited about in one of the 3 acts, and then immediately afterward, I'd just go, I have no idea how to get from this point to the point in the 2nd act. And that's really where discovery writing has kind of helped for me, because the novel I just recently finished, which is honestly the novel I had the most fun writing, how I actually wrote that one was, it wasn't fully discovery writing to me, but it was discovery writing in the idea that I would just kind of roll with the events as I thought of them. So what happened was, I'd start with one idea of where to move forward to. Like, in this case, the book was about a zombie plague. So I'd be writing until the moment that the first zombie showed up. And then after that happened, I would just go, okay, what are the consequences of this? I would take what I had already written and just kind of extrapolate based on what I understood about my characters and about the world I'd created. And then I go, okay, he met the first zombie. The zombie plague's gonna spread, and then I just write from there, and then the plot would just kind of simmer around in my mind until I went, oh my gosh, that's another important plot point I can write, and I'd write towards that. So it's not really outlining, but it's kind of discovering the outline as I write it, which definitely seems like an oxymoron, but it's the best kind of short phrase I can use to describe my process.
I mentioned before in a previous episode that I wrote an entire novel out longhand once. I was going through some of my notes for that just now. And yes, I'm sorry, Jonah, I know it hurt your little heart. It hurt mine too, and my hands. But I found out I don't actually write extensive outlining notes. They usually just amount to about a page, maybe 2 pages if I forget where my outline notes were, or I have to redo it in some major way. But I think while I was writing that longhand novel, because I had to work with what I was writing physically, I think I stuck more rigidly to that outline than anything I had before. And even in revisions, I think I've added 2 scenes total based on writing group feedback. But I think at the very least, I've always had a beginning and an end point and at least 8 points in between. And when I'm not writing a ridiculous longhand notebook full of words, one thing I do is I keep a document or a Scrivener tab I call Word Dump. And those are the snippets that I know are going to go somewhere. I don't know where they are, but at some point, she's going to have to talk to your sister about this. Someone's going to try to assassinate somebody like this. And I don't know where it's going to be, but I have a little fledgling version of that scene that I can plug in later when I get to the point where I know it's supposed to go.
I have all the thoughts about outlining and or not, just because I've tried a lot of different versions. I've tried the discovery writing, I've tried the outlining. Something I found, I think, is that it matters, at least to me, a lot what it is I am writing. If I'm writing a short story from a limited perspective or someone that is similar to me, I can discovery write that. If I'm writing a novella that's a mystery, I can discovery at the beginning and then I get stopped because I need to know more since it's a mystery about who did it and how they did it. And I got to get all those details before I can continue onward. When it comes to writing more novel length, I definitely started as a discovery writer, writing like 7, 8 perspectives, which was crazy. Not something I recommend. And then later, I tried to do the outlining approach. In Brandon's class, he talked a lot about having a point that you're excited to write and then figuring out everything that needs to happen for that point to take place. And so I figured out maybe 7 key points in my novel that had 2 perspectives. And I went through and figured out like, what are all the beats that need to happen in order for those big things to take place? And then how do those, like which ones of those can intersect? Like which chapters that can I have where I'd be building like 2 toward one toward another, like that. The problem I have found with outlining, though I do like outlining, that's more how my brain works, is something that others, I mean, I don't think so much here have said, but if you listen to talks about outlining versus, discovery writing, is the motivation to continue writing. It can feel like once you've created an outline for something that you know how it ends, it's like, I did it, my job here is done, time to move to the next project. And so it's tough because there are instances where knowing what's going to happen makes you excited to write it. So it can be either, it can be motivation to write, or it can be, well, I've already fleshed this out. So, so I think that depends a lot on the person. What I've done in my most recent story, which seems to be working really well for me, is much like actually what Cody described at the beginning, which is I broke my story into 4 parts, mainly because I was trying to keep it to a certain word count for YA. And I only let myself plan the first like 5 chapters out of a 20 chapter book. I was like, that's it. You can only plan 5 chapters. And then you got to like wait and see what happens after that. And so after I finished those 5 chapters, like, okay, now you can plan the next 5 chapters. That's it. Now, of course, after I got to the end of the 10th chapter, my brain immediately like figured out the ending and everything. But I haven't let myself really plot out and plan that stuff. And I have found that it's become this nice sort of middle ground for me of there is planning that's getting to happen, but at the same time, I also don't quite know everything that's happening. So there's still more mystery there for me to get excited about.
Yeah, you look at the other extreme end. We've all referenced several times now Brandon Sanderson's class. That's where most of us met. Correct me if I'm wrong, everybody, but I seem to recall him mentioning as a part of that class that he outlines so extensively that he has something like 10,000 word outlines per 100,000 words of finished product. So he's writing fully 10% of the material right up front. I mean, that would drive me insane. It would kill my motivation to find out what was going to happen, like Jeff was saying. But obviously for him, it works. He's a very workman-like writer, right? He really takes that seriously and he puts in his hours every day.
Show you what that looks like? Like, is it?
He didn't show us the actual outlines themselves. No, he just mentioned that number that he really did create outlines that were specific enough that they were about 10% of the ultimate length of what he was writing.
Just to jump in on that, I'm trying to remember if it was like an outline or if it was just 10,000 words of world building that he would do. Because I easy write 10,000 words of world building about like the magic systems and all this stuff like that. That like you can knock that out real fast.
I'm pretty sure he said outlining. I'd be happy to be wrong about that. But,
I think
specifically what he said about outlining that I remember both from his class and from episodes on writing excuses that he's talked about is that for him, outlining is about getting the plot beats down. And I think the distinction that has to be made here between like the difficulties of outlining and the advantages of outlining tends to be the distinction between character and plot. Because I know for me that the reason that discovery writing calls me so much is because I can nail character. Like I have no problem making up people in my head, possibly because I have too many voices in my head to count and they could at least use a face. But because character comes so easily for me, that is how that is what I use as a crutch for plot, where I use my characters to extrapolate the plot from it. But for Brandon, and the way that he described his outlining, he said that what he does is he outlines the story beats and then discovery writes his chapters so that the characters feel organic. Because if I recall correctly, when he's talked about some of the difficulties he's had, it's that sometimes some of his characters can seem very one-dimensional, possibly because he's outlining or possibly because plotting is his strength. And that definitely appears to be one of his strengths if you've ever read his books. So I think the way, I don't want to prescribe anything about Brandon's mindset. Brandon, if you're watching, I'm sorry. I don't want to read too much into your brain. But from what I can see about when he's talked about outlining, the reason it works for him doing that level of detail is because plot is the thing that comes very easily to him. So once he gets the plot out of the way, his excitement is not about figuring out what's going to happen next. His excitement is figuring out how are the characters going to react to this? Who are these people that are going through this script that I have built for them? And that's the discovery aspect of it for him. And that's what I think he would get excited about.
I think what a lot of us are getting at is that an outline is not just a list of events, but it's your notes and planning in advance of how your characters and your world are going to shape up.
Well, they're necessarily intertwined, right? And whether you start on one side and fill in the other, or start on the other side and fill in the first, each side is going to inform the other. Your characters have to match up with your plot, or else you've got a bad book. You've got, one of those TV episodes where people do things because the plot demands it instead of it being matching the character. And so almost no matter what motivates you or where you start, you're going to have to do some matching somewhere along the way.
Yeah, and I think just continuing my contrarian streak, like Jonah, I tend to think that making characters is my strength. That's the people I come up with before I ever have an idea about the plot. But I've always felt that in knowing my characters, I get so into their heads that discovery writing and having to have them make decisions on the fly is like asking me to make a decision on the fly. And I can't do that. And so I have to plan. I have to go, okay, I know my character so well. There's no way I could, if I try to put myself in a gladiator fight, for example, which is what I've been writing a lot of lately, I don't know what I would do. And I am essentially putting myself in the character's shoes. So I have to plan out what these exchanges look like. So I don't even know if it's that much of a different. I think it's more of what Cameron was saying, how plot and character are intertwined, and that your process is really just your process. This sort of leads me to a sub question I wanted to ask about this. Can you outline character development? Can you plan how your characters are going to change over time? Ready, go.
I did. That was the bullet point list of like, these are the events we're excited about. I was like, okay. Now, well, I mean, there were different power levels because it was like, of course, magic systems, but also like interactions. You can plot relationships in that way, like first meeting, now like the meet cute, and like now they actually spend a longer date together, now so on and so forth. So if I want them to end up together, you can think, what are all the beats that are going to lead to them ending up together? And so I do think there is something interesting about that sort of beat sheet, if you will, leading to that desired goal and figuring out how those different points again can intersect in certain chapters. So chapters are doing multiple things. So yeah, no, I did do some of that, and I do look forward to going back to that book. I think it can work.
Jeff, can I ask, if you have like these beats that you want to get to, what I found at times when I've thought in that way and then tried to write it is that those beats are going to be really good. It's the bits in between where like even writing I'm dragging because I'm excited about this thing, but then like, oh my goodness, I didn't anticipate the kind of slog or how bored I would be getting there, And so then when I'm more discovery writing, like everything, I try to make everything have an urgency a bit more that I have more trouble with when I have distinct beats I'm trying to hit. So just kind of your thoughts or everybody's thoughts on that.
I think sorry, just to quickly respond, then obviously, but I think what helped within the situation that I was doing is I had many beats. So I definitely think that would happen if I only had maybe 1 to 3 things that I was working toward, but there ended up being like 7+ that I was doing. So to get all of those various beats to intersect, it would mean that every single chapter had at least one beat that it was hitting out of those like 7 things that I was building toward, if not multiples. So that didn't happen quite as much. I mean, don't get me wrong, I definitely know what you're talking about, especially for a bigger beat. And it's like, okay, I got to do kind of the lead up to feel that time. But I think if you are tracking all the beats you need to take care of, or all the major beats, there is a lot there to do.
I was just going to say that I think, especially if you've got a story you're having trouble with, trying to track your character arcs and plot them out a little bit more than maybe you have can often be a fantastic diagnostic tool. My previous novel to the one that I just recently worked on, I got to the end of it and I was super dissatisfied, and I was getting bad feedback from the people I was giving it to, and went back and realized that I had betrayed some of the promises that I had made as an author at the beginning of the book. When you think about it, why do people read books? We're introducing you to someone we're going to make you care about, and then we're promising implicitly that we're going to end someplace satisfying with that character. And if you don't, you're going to get some real upset readers. And so that speaks to me to the benefit of sort of knowing, at least for your main character, maybe for a couple of your secondary characters, sort of knowing what emotional beats they're going to hit along the way and how they're going to change. Now, speaking to Steve's problem with that, not that this works every time, but frequently when I find myself slogging and like waiting to get to the stuff that I care about, my first question that I always have to ask myself is, does this scene really need to be here? And sometimes it does, and you've just got to slog through and go back and fix it later. But lots of times you can just hand wave it. You know, you can sort of reference the event that needs to happen without having to see it on screen or whatever. And you can get past some of the slog, which if it's a slog to write, it's probably going to be a slog for somebody to read. So a lot of times that has helped me out frequently.
If I may, I want to go back to Cody's original question here, because as soon as he asked, can you plan or outline character development, my instant gut reaction was to recoil in horror at the very thought of it. How dare you insinuate that we plan our characters in advance? But the more I thought about it, every time that I have gotten a piece of feedback from various writing groups that they didn't understand what my characters were doing, it was because I was so close to the thing I was excited about writing that I had sacrificed genuine character development in order to get to that thing more quickly. But even then, I don't think that was a bad idea, because knowing in advance what I was going to write helped me reach that in, a timely manner, as opposed to exploring my characters to the point that nothing ever happened with the plot. So obviously you can plan character development. I think the question is, if you do, are you prepared for the risks involved? And if you do fall into the pitfalls of planning characters in advance and potentially sacrificing organic character development for the plot, are you prepared for the going back and revising that you will need to do to kind of fix that up? Like, it's honestly a question of how much do you want to do in the first draft versus how much do you want to do in the second draft. And for a lot of people who are, compulsive revisers and such, they're perfectly happy to just plot along and leave the character development for the second draft once they understand how everything goes down. And then for me, I'm just like, I want my characters to feel nice from the beginning so that when they do things, I will be happy about them doing things instead of feeling like I'm just playing with cardboard cutouts.
I'm going to have to do a surprise, guys. I'm going to have to agree with Jonah on something. The reason I asked the question, because I initially thought, oh, of course you can't. There's no way. Plot is something that we plan. Plot is something that we make up. But in many ways, characters are organic, dynamic beings that are different at every point that you look at them, and there's almost like a black box what goes on in there. But the more I think about it, I think that parts of characters are black box, and it's nothing we can change. The initial character that we come up with their backstory and all the world building surrounding it, there's not much we can sort of plan about what they'll do, but a lot of character development is reacting to situations that we put them in. In many ways, it's kind of like you're flicking a marble. A marble's rolling across a table. Character development is you poking it with a stick to make it go in the direction you want. You can't change anything fundamental about the marble, but you can change which way it's going with your situations and all that things.
So what you're saying is that every author is essentially a kid with a magnifying glass squatting over an anthill.
Okay, that
If you're
analogy at
killing
least
your
makes more
characters-
sense than poking a marble with a stick. I'm
Well,
very confused
it only
about
works
why
if you're
doing
George R.R. Martin. If you're killing all your characters, yes.
Mm.
But yeah, so what do we think? What do we think about how do character decisions factor into this? Because we have throughout this whole thing, we've had this dichotomy of planning out events and planning out plot, but then our characters have to react to them. And the discovery, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the discovery writer motto is, I will let my characters react organically and then move the plot along with them. You know, this is a very Stephen King way of doing it. He wrote in his book that, look, I just take characters and put them in a situation. You know, you have these kids and there's this clown coming after them. And then the entire book is just what the kids do. But then you have sort of the new, what I would say is the outline thing of, I need to know where the story's going because characters are humans and humans are so complicated. There's no way I can, there's no way that I can write things on the fly for these complicated humans to do. So is there any way of reconciling this? I know Jeff said that one of the ways is sort of that halfway outlining perspective where you plan things a little bit in advance, but kind of as you go, sort of like Anne Lamott's headlights only illuminate the few feet in front of you, but you can make the whole trip that way. Are there any other solutions or any other ways we can merge these two competing viewpoints?
I think sometimes characters inform events and sometimes events inform characters. I wrote a book recently that none of you have read yet because I just finished a month ago where the entire climax hinges on this 17-year-old girl making a bad decision. And so I needed to get her into a position where she's offended enough at somebody that she would make that decision. So I set up, and so what I needed to do was I needed to make somebody make her mad. And I spent the entire book building up to that point where they would offend each other. And so she could get herself into a situation and then get out of that situation and reconcile herself with this person who's offended her. Because I need characters to make this decision based on nothing in their environment, nothing that will give them an advantage. I just need people to be mad. So I think sometimes your events need to be character driven and sometimes your characters need to be event driven.
Yeah, honestly, I was going to say, I don't know that these things are in opposition so much as it's just a spectrum. On the one end, you have extreme planning, and on the other hand, you have extreme not, extreme character-driven development. And I think pretty much every author out there, if they're being honest with themselves, lives somewhere between those two extremes. And maybe you tend to live more on one side than on the other, but you're not stuck there. You can, if things aren't working, plan a little bit more. If you're planning a ton and things aren't working, well, then ignore your outline for a little bit and just see what happens when these characters start to play. The great thing is that you can be anywhere you want to along that slide or slider or spectrum or whatever.
I think what's important to consider too is two core aspects of what that either outline or discovery writing or a mix of those is going to do for you. Is one, ideally end with a good story, right? And obviously that could happen maybe earlier if you're doing a lot of the work up front with the plotting, or later if you're more discovery writing and then having to revise your way to a place where, it all kind of clicks and works. But also motivating you to write. So I think it is important to experiment with different strategies for plotting versus not. So you can find, Cody talked about being a convert to plotting after experience and just realizing, that it's not set in stone, and it could affect, the project you are doing, as I talked about, could affect the type of writer you are for that. You don't always have to be one thing. You can change over time. The best way you're going to find out is through some experimentation, I think.
So if I was to give a summary, it would be this: you can do whatever you want, folks. Outlining is great. Outlining has its weaknesses as well. Discovery writing is great. Discovery writing has its weaknesses. Just like the characters we have trouble with, we are human, we are dynamic, and we don't have to be one direction or the other. So if we are to give a hopeful message in this wonderful holiday time, it would be your writing process is the correct writing process for you at any time. If you change it, still the correct process for you. So just go and write, do it the way you want, and just look for maybe ways to improve it. And that's all we can really ask. So on behalf of all of us here, I would like to wish you all a Merry Christmas. Until next time, we shall see you later, blockheads. Good night.